Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Peter Dixon. I am the director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Master's Program at Columbia University. This is part of our regular webinar series, which happens on the first Thursday of every month. You can find the link for that page in the chat. And today I'm extremely happy to welcome two colleagues and friends whose work I admire very much to talk to us about innovations in community engagement. Dr. Naomi Levy, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Santa Clara University and faculty affiliate at the Possibility Lab at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Amy Lerman, a professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and director of the Possibility Lab. We'll follow a pretty simple format today. Dr. Levy and Dr. Lerman will present their slides to us. Then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. You will find a Q&A box on your Zoom screen. So as you are listening to the presentation, please note your questions there. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll have a chance to read those to engage in a discussion with our presenters. So let me give the mic to Professor Levy, who is going to start the presentation. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you see my slides? Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much, Peter, for inviting us. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about the Firsthand Framework for Policy Innovation, which is a research initiative that lives at the Possibility Lab. And full disclosure, a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about today, Peter was very closely involved with. So this is very much collaborative work that we've done together. So the Firsthand Framework for Policy Innovation begins with a basic premise, and that is that the people who are closest to social problems have unique insights into how best to solve them. And the problem is that these are the very people who are often excluded from the conversations where policy is being made. So the Firsthand Framework is meant to be a corrective to this problem. We have done the Firsthand Framework in a number of different issue areas in a number of different parts of California. But the one I'm going to be spending the most time talking to you about today is a project that we did in the city of Oakland on the issue of safety. This is our very first Firsthand Framework project. I'll mention the others as well. But what I want to make sure to emphasize is that the Firsthand Framework, the whole point of it is to drive policy innovation and do that through these insights that come from folks who are closest to the social problems we're trying to solve. So let me explain a little bit more about why we think this is important. Generally, when policymakers are trying to understand problems and solve them, they use metrics that we would refer to as sort of top-down metrics. So just for example, in the issue of safety, safety tends to be defined and measured through crime statistics. And the problem with that is that if crime statistics is how we are defining safety, then all the solutions to the issue of public safety is going to happen through the criminal justice system, and it is then going to be evaluated through crime statistics. But what we want to do is adjust that. We turn to firsthand indicators, and firsthand indicators are basically just the signs and signals that people are already using in their daily lives to figure out how things are going. If we're able to identify these indicators and co-create them with community members, then we can use them to help drive policy innovation. And when we do that, we are prioritizing the voices of the people who are most impacted. We're tapping into their expertise, which is different from the so-called experts. And we're capturing important dimensions of the problem that we haven't been paying attention to before. And then any solutions that come out of this work are necessarily going to be relevant to the lives of the people who are most impacted. So that's the basic premise of the firsthand indicator process. when we do this, we can then, rather than like replacing crime statistics, we can supplement them. And then the policy solutions that might come out of this will necessarily be bigger and broader. So I just want to be really clear that I'm not saying that we should do away with crime statistics or with criminal justice solutions to public safety problems, but that we should supplement them. Okay, so we have done the firsthand indicator approach. We've used the firsthand framework in a number of different areas. Like I'll be talking today mostly about the public safety one, but we also did this on the issue of health with Latino migrants in the Inland Empire, which is sort of in the southeastern part of California, where we asked about how people can tell when there's more or less health in their lives. So we heard indicators like you have a place to live as something that's intimately connected to the health and well-being of their communities. On the issue of housing, we've done a couple different projects. One with residents of affordable housing units, where instead of the top-down metrics that the developers were already using, like the number of units with that were paying their rent on time, or the number of lease violations in their units, we heard about indicators like how things are going in the building, like whether the other residents are greeting each other. We also did a project on the issue of housing with a couple of organizations that are serving folks who are experiencing homelessness, so living in interim housing shelters, where we heard about things like whether people are checking things off of their list on a daily basis as a way to tell how things are going in their daily lives. On the issue of behavioral health, we did a project working with folks who provide multidisciplinary responses to behavioral health emergencies. So we did focus groups with responders, clients, family members. And instead of the top-down metrics like how many jail diversions there are, we heard about things like whether some of the police who first responded decide they're not needed, and they leave the scene. That was an indicator of how people knew that a behavioral health emergency response was going well. Okay. So how do we do all of this? I'm going to now take you through our 5-step process, and I'll talk you through this with the Oakland project specifically. So we always begin the firsthand framework with deep partnerships, and in the city of Oakland, Peter and I actually spent the better part of a year building trust with community members in Oakland. We reached out to 40 different community-based organizations. We held conversations with 32 of them. From those conversations, we established 6 partnerships with organizations that were working closely with residents in the city of Oakland. And then we conducted trainings. And I want to be really clear here. We weren't just training our partners in how to do the firsthand framework. We also were being trained by them in what was happening in their communities and how to work and build trust with their community members. Part of those trainings involved defining the communities that we were going to reach with the organizations. And the communities that we reached with them really varied in terms of whether they were defined by geography, by identity, or by lived experience. So just quickly, I'll walk you through these 6 organizations on the screen and tell you about the communities we reached with them. And one thing I want to be really clear here is that we were very intentional in trying to reach communities that were most impacted by issues of safety and violence. So I'll start with BOSS here, which is Building Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency, which is an organization that works primarily with African-American residents in the city of Oakland. And we, through them, reached 3 different neighborhoods in the city of Oakland, some in East Oakland and some in West Oakland. So their groups were defined both by identity and geography. Similarly with the Unity Council, we reached 2 different communities, one where the Spanish-speaking residents of Oakland, primarily in the Fruitvale neighborhood, and then the other group we reached through them were Mom speakers, again, throughout the city of Oakland. Tribe was a little bit different. They work entirely in a place-based way. They work with residents who all live near a park, and so we reached all the residents that lived in proximity to the park, and it was an incredibly diverse population that came to those groups. And then the other three groups, it was primarily not geography or necessarily identity. It was more about lived experience. So the Center for Empowering Refugees and Immigrants works with primarily Southeast Asian refugees. So we worked with Khmer speaking and Burmese speaking refugees and their families. Missy works with young women and girls or gender nonconforming individuals who are either at risk of or had experienced sex trafficking. And then finally, Courage works with system impacted youth. These are young people who either themselves have been incarcerated, their family members have been incarcerated, or they've come up through the foster care system. And so altogether, we identified these 9 communities that we worked with. And in those communities, we held focus groups with 24 different focus groups altogether with 350 different individuals. We also went back and held town halls with them. And if you count all of the work that went into this, the community members, our time, the staff members' time, all of it, we're talking about close to 2,000 hours or over 2,000 hours of community engagement. From that work, we develop firsthand indicators. So the way we do that is through focus groups and these town halls I mentioned, where we sit down. The picture on the left here is from the SERI group, one of the SERI groups with Khmer speaking refugees. And then we present the indicators that we co-create in these focus groups back to the community members through town halls where people in their own languages are looking at and reviewing the indicators that we co-created and then voting on the ones that matter most to them. So what did we find in the city of Oakland? Well, when we asked people what signs show you if your community is safe or not, we heard about, we collected, I think, close to 600 different indicators of safety. And they ranged across these 7 different dimensions that are figured here. So I'll take you through each of these dimensions and give you an example of each. So the biggest category is violence and stressors, and this is the sort of stuff that often we think of when we think of safety, like people being so used to gunshots that they block them out. But as you can see, not all of the indicators fell under this standard kind of way that we think about safety. We also heard indicators about the way that the state tries to suppress violence and some of the negative effects of that. So, for example, under state control, we heard the indicator, you can name a lot of people who have been killed by police. And I remember really clearly that this particular indicator came from a young woman who had lost her brother to gun violence, violence from the police. In addition to those 2 categories that were very, very closely tied to issues of crime and efforts to control crime, there were a lot of indicators that came in other dimensions. So social capital is our second biggest category. And here we see an example of a positive indicator. This is, and a large number of these social capital indicators were worded in a positive way. So you know when you're safe, when people are friendly, waving, saying hi to each other, for example. Another big category were young people. A lot of the indicators had to do with what was going on with young people. So, for example, kids are out playing until the streetlights come on. We also heard indicators that had to do specifically with economic security. And I want to be really clear here. Every one of these economic security indicators came out of a conversation about how people know if they're safe or not in their communities. So people mention these things in direct connection to how safe they feel in their communities. So, for example, the cost of organized sports being too high for most families, people were connecting to safety, because if kids can't participate in sports, then things feel less safe to people. There were also a lot of signs just having to do with the physical environment, like what people see out on the streets, like finding drug paraphernalia on the streets. And finally, there were a number of indicators having to do with health and mental health. So, for example, doctors disregarding what you feel and say. After sourcing all of these indicators and coding them and categorizing them and sifting through them, the next step comes with mapping them. And in mapping them, what we're trying to do is determine whether we can see the feedback loops that are driving cycles of violence or cycles of safety. So for example, here I've got this negative feedback loop where some of the indicators might be really, really close to the question of safety, and some of them we might think of as consequences of safety or the lack thereof, or even causes or root conditions that lead to them. So let me give you an example of how we can map the indicators into a feedback loop like this. So if you take the direct measure of kids joining gangs because it seems like their best option, we can go forwards in time and see the way that that leads to a situation where kids are committing crimes without realizing that they're causing harms. But we can also go backwards in time to see what led to that happening, like teenagers having to rely on each other because older generation is absent. And we can go even further back in time and see the root conditions that is leading to that, like parents being afraid to actually parent their kids. And when you lay indicators out in this sort of way, you can start to see the dynamic processes that lead to these negative feedback loops, right? Because the more kids are committing crime without realizing the harms they're causing, that leads even further into that root condition. So we can really see these negative feedback loops. But I want to be really clear and say that we didn't just hear about negative feedback loops. We also heard about positive feedback loops, where if you take the direct measure of kids having basic life skills, knowing how to manage money, we can go forward in time and see that that means that they're going to think of alternative choices for their lives. We can also go backwards in time and think about, what leads to kids having these life skills. It's people having mentors that guide them. And that can be traced back to the root condition of successful people coming back to the neighborhood and serving as role models for young people. So the idea here is if we're able to map all these indicators into and have them help us reveal these dynamic processes, we can zoom all the way out to this very complex diagram and see the ways in which these feedback loops are self-reinforcing. What the payoff of doing this is it helps us identify places that we can intervene. And this is where we're starting to get into the policy innovations, right? If we can see how one thing leads to another, we can think of ways that we can try to frustrate those negative feedback loops or promote the positive cycles and really start to make a difference. And when you think about these processes layering on each other in the different dimensions that we looked at. So I was looking just at young people, but we can also see this in areas of the physical environment and so forth. We can really start to see how solutions can be sourced. So in the next stage of the process, with the Oakland project, we partnered with the Oakland's Department of Violence Prevention. We contracted with 8 of their former life coaching clients, and together they came up with a name for their group. They called themselves the New Narrative, because these are people who used to be part of the cycles of the negative cycles of violence, and they were trying to change their stories and change the story of the city of Oakland at the same time. We worked with them to map out those indicators. And then they came up with small scale rapid interventions that we funded. We did 2 different things. One was cleaning up a park and painting a mural. And the other one was distributing hygiene kits to unhoused residents in the city of Oakland. And we have a sweet little video that we put together about that work. Can't show it to you now, but if that QR code will lead you to it. But these are the New Narrative team, in addition to designing and implementing these small scale rapid interventions, they also came up with proposals for the city of Oakland. And that takes us to the last stage of the process, which is piloting and evaluation. So those community-led interventions I've already talked about, but the proposals for the city of Oakland are can lead to interventions. And all of that can be evaluated with the firsthand indicators themselves, because every one of these indicators can be turned into a quantitative metric that can be collected on a longitudinal basis to evaluate those interventions. They can be found in existing administrative data. They can be found through observational data, and they can also be found in by conducting ongoing surveys. And we are in the midst right now of putting together a dashboard of existing administrative data in a way that can be, or also existing large data sources like mobility data, to try to measure some of these indicators so that the city of Oakland can track its ongoing public safety work on an ongoing basis. Okay, I'm going to stop there so I can give Amy a chance to talk, but I want to just take a second to thank all the institutional partners that we worked with to do this project, including our funder, California 100, and the California Community Foundation, our institutions outside of UC Berkeley, Santa Clara, and Brandeis, where Peter was when we were doing this work. And finally, the inspiration for our work, which is the Everyday Peace Indicators research group that we really borrowed a lot of this methodology from. And then the last slide I'm going to put up has a couple more QR codes. One of them takes you directly to the report that documents all of this work, and the other one takes you to an interactive website where you can explore all of those indicators.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I'll just, as Amy comes on, I'll just take this moment to remind everyone in the audience that if you do have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So when Amy is done with the second half of the presentation, then we'll have a chance to engage in some Q&A. So please do note your questions there. All right, thanks.
Thanks so much. Naomi, it's always so fun to hear you talk about that project. I have heard you speak about it, and every time I just get excited about that incredible work. And for those who are interested, the Naomi's team has also, as she mentioned, done these other projects on FFPI that you can Google Help Them Harvest, and that's the microsite and the report on some of the Inland Empire work and others. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Peter. It's so nice to see you, and it's really exciting to be able to talk about some innovations in community engagement. So the work that I'm going to talk about really is sort of situated in this larger context of increasingly complex policy challenges that are faced by state and local government. Increasingly, state and local are being asked to take on things like climate change, regulation of generative AI, housing and homelessness here in California is a major issue. And so really thinking about how we solve problems, these big, complex public problems. And we're trying to do it in the context of historically low trust and historically high polarization, at a time when it's really hard to bring people together to talk productively about how we solve these really deep-rooted problems. So the Possibility Lab, we're a sort of unusual research lab at a university in that we're about a third policy practitioners, folks who come out of state and local government, who've spent most of their careers working inside government, about a third researchers, and about a third folks who come out of community organizations or private sector and have done that kind of work. And we come together to try and think about how we can do research on the ground, really answering questions that are of immediate relevance to our state and local partners, to our community partners, really thinking about the problems that they are trying to solve and figuring out how we can work together with them to pilot things in real time that'll help us do that. And in particular, we're really thinking about new ways for government and community to come together in a sustained and iterative way. So some of the sort of the fundamentals of how we're thinking about this work. The first is really that voting isn't the only way to guide public decisions. So we're not focused on elections. In fact, we don't do any election work when we're thinking about civic engagement. We're really thinking about policy making, and in particular, policy making at the administrative level. So all of the departments and agencies that do the design and implementation of programs that directly affect people's lives. And that means that we're really working directly with departments and agencies on things like housing, on the Housing and Community Development Organization at the state level here in California, to Naomi's project really thinking about Department of Violence Prevention in the city of Oakland as a primary place that public safety policy gets designed and implemented. And finally, we really start from the premise that government workers can't address public problems on their own, that they need community in order to do a better job. And here, I think there's a really important point to be made, which is that civic engagement, in our view, isn't a symbolic activity, and it isn't even something that has value in its own right, although we believe that it does. We're really thinking of it as instrumental, that it's designed to solve meaningful problems and to do that in a way that necessarily relies, to Naomi's point, on the expertise of people across communities. And so what we're trying to do is bring that expertise directly into the policymaking process, bring diverse voices and diverse stakeholders together with government to come up with really meaningful, practical, implementable solutions. And what we're thinking about here is this sort of diversity of expertise. One of the things that I think is really important about the kinds of problems we're trying to tackle is that they are complicated problems. They're going to need all of the different kinds of expertise that we can bring to the table: institutional and administrative, lived experience and personal, technical and scientific, indigenous and native. Really trying to think about all of the different ways that you can approach a problem and all of the different kinds of expertise that our partners can bring to the table. The other thing we're really thinking about is going beyond typical models of citizen participation, which are sort of fairly perfunctory. Traditionally, the model of civic participation that we think about is like hosting a town hall where people can come and talk to government. And so we're thinking about things like the Arnstein ladder of citizen participation, which thinks about all of the different degrees of power that you can give to communities. And we're really thinking about co-governance, the idea that you can equalize the playing field between government and community, that you can come together as equal partners, that you can build that partnership over time and in an iterative way that builds trust. And that really what you're thinking about is co-governance, right? Coming up with solutions and implementing them and sharing accountability and responsibility. This is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's been really widely used, but mostly outside the United States. So think participatory budgeting, where communities come together and they really think together about the allocation of resources within a jurisdiction. Digital democracy efforts have been really widely used in places like Taiwan that pioneered these big nationwide digital democracy exercises that actually led to things like regulation for Uber and Lyft. And we've been learning a lot by connecting directly with people across the world who have been using these models and really thinking about how they can be applied in the United States. And there are lots of ways in which it is difficult to take these models and bring them to the US. Again, because trust in the US of government is very low in ways that aren't necessarily echoed in some of these other spaces, but in particular that polarization and diversity are very high in the US. And that makes these sorts of widespread, large-scale digital and in-person exercises particularly difficult. We have seen models of this that I think we're building on, and the one that I'll just highlight is the Irish Citizens Assembly. So here in Ireland, they have a permanent body of 100 citizens who are selected through sortition, and they debate issues and they provide recommendations on really thorny topics: abortion, climate, population policies for an aging population, right? Things that have been really touchy within Irish society, and they come together through structured deliberation to come up with, again, actionable recommendations that they can make. And so we've been using all of these models from around the world to think about how we would do this at scale in a place like California. And one of the things that we've done over time is to design a model that we call the impact model, which is really a 6-step model to help governments do a more meaningful set of civic engagement activities over time with the communities that they want to serve. And impact stands for initiate, mobilize, plan, act, catalyze, test. So in the initiate phase, we really work sometimes at length with our government partners to think carefully about why they're doing civic engagement, which seems like it should be a really easy question, but often it takes some real thought. Civic engagement, again, is sort of an exercise that you do because you're either required to or because you feel like it builds legitimacy, but often they haven't thought about how they're going to use the information that they get, how to structure the engagement in a way that is actually going to lead to the type of input that is going to be really immediately useful to them, who to bring to the table, conditional on what the stakes are and who's directly impacted. So we do a lot of work up front, sort of doing our homework with government. We also spend this time learning what previous civic engagement has been done already, not just by the department or agency that we're working with, but other departments and agencies that have already tapped this community, and what can they learn from the previous civic engagement so they're not asking people to spend time with duplicative effort, which can be a real source of frustration for community partners. Once we've established the goals and the purpose and the constraints of why government is doing this work, we then move on to the mobilize phase, where we bring in a select group of community partners who can work with government to think about the community and its needs, to make sure that we're really prioritizing the perspectives and needs of the community so that it's not just a one-way street where government is asking for input, but is really working collaboratively to do pre-planning and information sharing. We then move on to planning. And when we're doing the planning phase, we're really thinking about where we are in the policymaking process. So for example, are you at a place where you're trying to open up and really brainstorm new policy ideas? And so you're trying to get the widest possible input? Or are you trying to narrow and take a set of policy ideas and prioritize them to come up with the recommendations that receive priority within the community? And those are two really different goals, two really different types of input you're trying to get. And so depending on where you are in kind of along the policy making process, you're going to structure the civic engagement in really different ways. So you might think about small focus groups where people can do brainstorming together, or you might think about digital ranking activities where people can take a whole bunch of different recommendations and rank them. You might think about design charrettes or civic assemblies where people can come and actually learn about and deliberate complicated problems. But the structure of the deliberation is really going to come directly from the definition of what you're trying to do. We then move on to ACT, where we recruit community members to participate and we carry out the civic engagement activities. Catalyze, where we're thinking about actually drawing out the recommendations and the learnings, and then testing. And here we're testing at lots of different levels. We're thinking about what the impact is of this civic engagement activity on individuals who participate. We're thinking about the types of recommendations that come out of the activity, and we're thinking longer term about those recommendations, how they get implemented, and if the implementation of those recommendations actually leads to the types of positive change that we're trying to accomplish in the policy problem. So we're currently working with lots of different partners across state and local government here in California. And as you can see from just this sort of selection of some of our partners, we're really agnostic about policy domain. We're working in labor and workforce, we're working with young people, we're working in economic and environmental domains, we're working in education and racial equity. And part of it is like we're really focused on the model and the process. And fundamentally, we think that most policymaking, if not all policymaking, can be improved by bringing in these different kinds of expertise. So I'm going to walk really quickly through just one example project that we've been working on. This is a project that's still ongoing. And so what I'll show you is just really preliminary results. But we've been working over the last year with the Strategic Growth Council here in California and the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation to think about bringing together diverse voices to do strategic planning for the state's climate future. So the Strategic Growth Council is actually a coalition of agencies and departments within California that do land use, climate, and energy planning. So it includes food and agriculture, natural resources, California EPA, health and human services, and they all are part of this Strategic Growth Council body so that they can do integrated planning for climate. And they historically have held this conference in Sacramento every year, where they bring people to Sacramento, they hold a sort of traditional conference. And this year they decided to do something really different, where instead they would go to regions and actually be in those regions with stakeholders there so that they could learn about what their priorities and needs are, so that they could bring more people together at the regional level, so that they could build relationships not just between state and local, but across these regions. And one of the real innovations was that they focused on bioregions rather than political regions. So a bioregion, right, is a kind of contained climate region. Think like this is where birds fly, and it doesn't necessarily overlap with political jurisdictions, which makes it both a complicated way to do this kind of organized planning, but also a really sensible way when it comes to climate future, because the shared governance of those spaces is going to really matter. And so they identified these 9 bioregions and are hosting a deliberative democracy event in each of these 9 bioregions. And so our approach has really followed this framework of impact. We started with Initiate, where we worked with SGC to really think about their priorities and goals. We then brought together the undersecretaries from all of the SGC departments and agencies and other delegates from the council. And we worked together to through a set of questions we call the Initiate questionnaire, which is really just a way to think about goals and priorities, constraints, and resources. We then convened this statewide virtual meeting with SGC that actually brought regional representatives from the nonprofit sector, from state and from local and regional government, from the private sector, from advocacy, from the foundation and philanthropy world. And we brought them all together and they worked in regional groups to articulate their immediate priorities, to decide how they should determine who should be invited to these deliberative democracy events, how the day should be structured, really thinking about this kind of co-planning, co-governance, mobilize phase. And what we settled on was a day-long deliberative policy process focused on generating policy action for both the state to take on and the local and regional governance. And the idea was to bring people together to think over the course of a day together, to deliberate on the pros and cons of different priorities, and then to really think about prioritizing recommendations. So we wanted to both generate and prioritize recommendations that the state could take forward as part of their long-term planning that could go into the state strategic plan, which will govern climate and energy planning and activity for the coming 5 to 10 years. And on the day of, we structured the deliberative process in a sequential way. So we started with this sort of idea of priorities, challenges, and assets, really helping on energy, climate, and land use to start from a shared understanding of where the region was. So this is the LA priorities, challenges, and assets. We used the registration form to get people to sort of submit and comment on some of these priorities, challenges, and assets so that we started from the shared knowledge in the room. We then put together a roundtable conversation guide, which was a step-by-step process for people to then gather in small groups and work their way through specific problems. So they started by defining the problem, trying to understand the causes and consequences of that problem. They then brainstormed solutions, and then they prioritized within their small groups what recommendations they really wanted to see the state take forward. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, we spent a lot of time making sure that we had representation from a broad array of organizations. State and local government and nonprofit community organizations were the most heavily represented within each event. But we also had private sector folks, we had researchers, we had philanthropy, we had tribal governance at each event. And there were hundreds of people in the room at each of the first 3 of these events in San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, representing a really diverse cross-section of interests when it came to climate and energy planning. In total, we at each regional event came up with about 50 policy actions, sort of really specific things that they had brainstormed that they'd like to see the state or regions doing. And those policy goals were across a wide array of different kinds of topics, sort of thinking about clean energy transitions, funding access and capacity building was a big one, streamlining processes, and regulatory process and enforcement, And so we were able to take this sort of broad array of policy actions and think about where they were grouped. And different regions had somewhat different distributions across these policy topics, but there was also a lot of similarity. So as we move forward with the remaining 6 of these events over the coming year, we'll also be thinking not only about the recommendations that come from each region, but how to really synthesize them across the state. In addition to these deliberations and these sort of worksheets on recommendations, we ended each deliberative democracy event by thinking about how we could measure a consensus around priority recommendations. And what we did was we used Polis, which is actually the tool that was used really widely in Taiwan. And the idea here is that you can take recommendations or statements that come from each of the discussion groups and put them into Polis, and then ask people to agree or disagree, to sort of rank and prioritize these different policy recommendations. And so in real time, we were able to take all of the worksheets that people had filled out in their small groups and put them into Polis. And then we asked everybody to log on to Polis and to spend a little time thinking about these recommendations. And in addition, people could enter new recommendations if there were things they came up with that weren't represented in their existing group recommendations. About 160 people. This is data from the Bay Area convening, but it's pretty similar to the other convenings. 100 people voted. About 2,400 votes were cast, and about 83 separate statements were submitted in addition to the ones that came from the group recommendations. And the really nice thing about Polis is it uses machine learning to cluster people into opinion groups. So rather than just relying on kind of majority rules, it actually lets you map group opinion across different sets of recommendations. So the idea here is that people from different areas of the region, or people who are coming from the local government versus the nonprofit sector, might have really different underlying groups of recommendations. And that part of what you want to be able to see is not just, is there a majority set of recommendations that receive support, but are there recommendations that a majority from each of these stakeholder groups supports? And so what you get in Polis is sort of real-time information about how these recommendations cluster by group, what kinds of underlying groups there are, and then you can think about how to bring recommendations forward that don't leave any group of stakeholders behind. So we're continuing to analyze the results from San Diego, Los Angeles, and Bay Area, which are the 3 convenings we've completed. Once we've completed all 9, we'll be able to analyze the patterns and themes across all of these different regions to think about region-specific, but also recommendations that hold across all or most of the regions. And then we're continuing to work really closely with SGC to think about how to use this information, both in the state's long-term strategic plan, which is currently being written, as well as to think about short-term changes that can be pretty easily enacted by SGC internally to be responsive in real time to some of the recommendations that come up. And I'll end by just saying that I think what we're learning is there's a lot of really important kind of large-scale changes that need to happen in order to make this kind of work possible. The first is really thinking about new forms of collaboration between government and researchers. And one of the things that we're really especially excited about the work that we're doing at the Possibility Lab across all of our projects is really thinking about how researchers can be ongoing partners to government. So not just taking evaluations forward and then reporting back, not just sort of taking data and using it for our own purposes, but really thinking together about questions that are both theoretically interesting and important and also practically interesting and important. And I think one of the things that we are really trying to push is that there doesn't have to be a trade-off between practical, socially important work and theoretically informed, publishable, peer-reviewable work. I think there's a growing group of researchers who are proving that there isn't a trade-off there, that you can do both, and that in fact doing both is really satisfying. I think also really thinking about forums for coordination across projects. So across all of our projects at the lab, we learn more by putting the learnings together. And so when we think about one-off projects, they can have self-contained learnings that we can later put together. But if we're thinking about all of our work at the same time as being part of a singular learning agenda, then we can select projects that help us continue to build on our knowledge about what kinds of civic engagement are really productive and where the challenges lie. And then finally, really thinking about the roles and relationships for philanthropy. So we're doing a lot of work with foundations and other funders who we think are really critical to investing in this work, particularly right now at this moment where we're seeing federal funding being pulled back. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you so much to you both. This is just so fascinating, and just reinforces how happy I am and lucky I feel to have you both to present just such engaging work with us. Um, I wrote down 11 different questions as I was listening to you, but we have 14 minutes left in our hour, so I'm just going to jump straight into the audience questions, and then we'll get to mine if we have time. So audience members, as I ask these questions, if other questions come to you, please go ahead and pop those into the Q&A. All right, I'm going to start with a question about trust, which is actually one of the questions I wrote down as well. So I'll just read it out, and then I think it's for both of you. So you talked about spending time building trust between you, the researchers, and the communities. And to that, I'll add policymakers as well, in order for these interventions to hold. And then this questioner adds, there also needs to be trust within communities themselves. And so the general question is sort of, what is the role of trust building in this work, I suppose? And yeah, happy to start. Maybe Naomi, we can start with you, and Amy, you can add on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out in the work that we do is that there are there aren't monolithic community views, right? Like there's actually a lot of disagreement, a lot of lack of trust between community members that can be surfaced through this work. When I read that question, one of the things that came to mind is what would happen in a lot of the focus groups as people listened to each other. I mean, I don't want to pretend like the focus groups themselves were part of the solution, but there was a lot of ways that by setting ground rules for the discussion and making space for people to disagree during the focus groups, we were able to have community members listen to each other. And so that was one of the first thoughts that I had. But I mean, Peter, you were part of the work as well. So I don't know if you also had any thoughts about about how the firsthand framework work dealt with issues of trust amongst community members. So
yeah, no, thanks. I don't want to take up more time, but I sort of had a similar thought to you in terms of this process actually being a way to constructively surface division and then put that division on the table as a subject of discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a way that when people looked at the lists of indicators in the town halls, they could sort of get windows into each other's perspectives as well. And I think that is an important part of trust building. I think it can be a starting point, but the community organizations themselves have to continue that work as well.
Yeah, so I will comment a little bit on the relationship building and trust building with our government partners as well. I think there's a huge need to do trust building there. And some of it is, and it goes in all directions. So when we think about building trust with our government partners, a lot of it is just reassuring them that we're not trying to do a kind of gotcha analysis of where they're failing and all the problems that they aren't doing a good job solving, but that we are totally solution focused. And that our job is really to make them look good by helping them solve problems and then to be able to document what they did to solve those problems, right? That's fundamentally our goal. And so we do a lot of just trust building with them over time where we can start by just helping them out. And really helping them achieve their goals and making it clear that we are partners in this work, that we are transparent, that really our goal is to work with them to improve the lives of the communities they serve, which is really at the end of the day what they want to be doing. I think also I wrote a whole book on trust in government, but somebody needs to now write a book on like government trusting communities. And right, it goes both ways. I think there's so we just did a training with about 30 like mayors and city council folks thinking about community engagement. And what kept coming up over time was this sort of like civic engagement PTSD that many of them had, where they're really nervous about doing civic engagement, both because it in their experience it has been um, really oppositional. Often it's just people yelling at them and venting about all of these problems that aren't totally in their control to solve. And so they're this kind of sounding board for frustration. And one of the things that we try and start with is this, like, it doesn't have to be like that, right? That you can structure civic engagement in ways that are really productive and empowering, both for you and for residents. And so, right, this is a really different way of thinking about how you do civic engagement. But you have to overcome the fear that you're opening Pandora's box and that all you're doing is asking people to vent their frustrations and tell you things that you kind of already know but don't know how to solve. And so really rethinking what that relationship can look like.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up. In the negotiation and conflict resolution office, we have a very sort of nerdy inside joke, which is whenever there's a problem, we'll just organize a town hall to talk about it.
Totally.
And anyone who's seen the TV show Parks and Rec and seen the way they represent town halls in those, I think illustrates exactly what you're talking about, or a part of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So
And they're
actually,
not,
I'm gonna
yeah, they're not wrong. They're not crazy when they say like town halls tend to bring out the crazies.
right.
Right. Town hall attendees, as we all know, are not representative of the population as a whole and aren't really set up for meaningful dialogue.
I'm gonna sneak in a question then, and then I have one more that I wanted to ask, or at least more of them. So, how do you know that these processes are successful?
That's a great question. And, I would love to think a little bit about how we would do a firsthand framework on success. And we'll just go around.
Mm,
But I do think, fundamentally, we know they're successful if they're improving people's lives. Right? If we're really making policies that come from the recommendations or the input and are deeply informed by the kinds of community engagement that we're doing, and if those recommendations ultimately are implemented and lead to positive change. So I think that's, we judge our success in the same way that we should be judging the success of government, in that like it should represent the views of people and then it should positively impact their lives. And so our projects, I think that have closed out and been things we can point to that are really successful are things where policy change has happened, either new funding, new programs that build on successes we've identified, regulations that come from communities themselves, that are things like oversight of generative AI that come from vulnerable communities and their input. Really starting to see that deep connection over time between the questions that are being asked, the input that's being provided, the policies that are being changed or adopted, and then the outcomes that we're really hoping to see for exactly the communities that participate on the front end.
yeah. All right, the next question talks about kind of the demand from partners for this kind of work. So I'll just read the question. Could you talk a bit about where the demand for this work comes from and how the findings have been used by local governments, to which you've already spoken a little bit? Is this a model that local governments, and I would add community groups as well, have adopted and integrated into their own decision making? And then this very kind person adds, this is all great, by the way. And I think this is a question both for firsthand framework work as well as the impact work.
I actually think that the question's probably more for the impact work, but I will say that people stumble upon the firsthand framework work, and just yesterday I had a conversation with somebody who runs a wellness ranch that does equine therapy, and she wanted to know if there's a way that we could use firsthand framework to help them come up with metrics to evaluate the work that they do. I think that there's in general, there is a lot of recognition that the metrics that we use to evaluate our work could be improved. The challenge, I think, is when is it worth all the effort it takes to go through and do a full firsthand framework process, because it is incredibly labor intensive and time intensive. Yeah, I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but I think that anybody who is creatively dissatisfied with existing metrics would be interested in using a tool like this.
Yeah, and then to that, I would add, just from my experience working with you, Naomi, agencies who know they're doing great work, but don't have the measures to demonstrate that work and actually really illustrate the impact that they see on a daily basis through their work. And I think crime statistics sort of are a perfect example of that lack of fit. Yeah, Amy, what about in sort of the impact work? What does demand look like?
It's enormous. I mean, I think we would love to be able to meet all of the demand of our state and local partners. And we're primarily, although not exclusively, operating in California, and we're increasingly seeing interest from other states to think about this work. I think in this moment in particular, state and local government are really trying to get creative about how they do this kind of problem solving, to think proactively about how we build the muscle for democracy at the state and local level, not just in a defensive way, but in a proactive strategy to, in many ways, build or rebuild the building blocks, these relationships between all of the different stakeholders and the governments that oversee some of the policy domains like education and safety that are the most critical to people's lives. And so I think what we're seeing is increased demand. If anything, we are in the really fortunate position where we have lots of partners coming to us to ask about how we might support some of their work. And then I think there's also a lot of demand for this, particularly among junior scholars and grad students who are really interested in thinking about how universities can play a more powerful role in providing accurate information and helping to really be an arbiter of truth in the world, of really collecting data that can directly inform policy, and not thinking about the work that we do as like, we'll just do it and then somebody will use it, but really thinking about how we can be more integrated. And at Berkeley, where we're a public university, I think we have an obligation to think about what role universities can and should play.
Yeah. I'll just sneak in one last question before we run out of time. You both mentioned technology in your respective presentations. Naomi, you mentioned this dashboard that you're developing. Amy, you talked about Polis and the use of machine learning. What is the role of technology, of AI in particular, in facilitating both the engagement side of this work and then the utility of the data that it produces?
Want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. The dashboard that we're working on right now is one of the things that was really clear in the work that we did in Oakland, especially, is that the communities that we're trying to whose wisdom we're trying to channel are both overstudied and underserved, and repeatedly returning to them to ask for data is it's an imposition, even if you compensate them for their time. And so what we're trying to do right now is get really creative in how to use existing sources of data that are being collected passively in a way that can channel their insights without putting further demands on them. Yeah. The challenge here, though, is that it quickly we need to think really carefully about making sure that we're not sort of entering into something that's more like surveillance like, right? Mm-hmm. But there, just as an example, one of the indicators that we heard a couple of times in the work was this idea of spatial mobility, like whether people feel safe to travel around their neighborhoods, right? And so what we're doing right now is trying to use existing data sources on cell phone mobility to track that on a census tract level, right? Not at an individual level, which would be too
Right.
surveillancy, right?
Right.
But like, can we see one census tract versus another if certain the residents of certain census tracts travel further from their homes or not, and or what percentage of them travel and such. So that's an example of using existing big data and machine learning tools to try to get at an insight that comes from the lived experience and bring those two things together.
So interesting. Thank you. Amy, in 30 seconds, how is technology facilitating your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it always has to be complementary. It's never going to be a replacement for face to face, but face to face can be via Zoom. I think you can have really meaningful. Right, we don't have to get all the way to generative AI. We can just use technology to facilitate the kinds of interactions that we're trying to promote. But I think we continue to look at how we can incorporate new tools. And in particular, if we really want to do this work at scale in a state like California, which is huge and diverse and regional, we're going to have to continue to think about how we can use technology and use it carefully, not as a substitute, but as a complement.
Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to check out the Possibility Lab website. There is so much there, and a lot of it is quite beautiful and engaging. Thank you again for sharing your work with us. And I personally look forward to seeing you soon, I hope.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for having
much.
us.